Sapta, how did you get into design? Did you go to a college or did you learn it all by yourself? How did you make it to Swiggy as the director of design? Now, these are some of the common questions that I get heard a lot from my viewers, from fellow designers, and also over various podcasts and meetups. I've narrated my story many times, but always on parts, because you see, it's difficult to connect the dots every single time because you don't really prepare your story in your head. And I also realized that I've never narrated this story completely on this channel for you all. So I thought, why not make a dedicated video on the same thing? What had been my journey all the way from college to where I am today, that is Director of Design at Swiggy. It's been quite a ride with a lot of challenges, learnings, and a hell lot of fun. So let's start right away from my college. As a lot of you know, I'm not a designer by my education. I'm actually an engineer, and I've gone to one of the most prestigious colleges of India, IIT Madras. Big name, right? But design was always my thing, more like a hobby and not really like a profession. Although I started designing way back in school when I got my first computer, but it was in college when I actually got hold of a lot of resources. I had access to internet, I had access to the local area network, and most importantly, I had access to a lot of great people who were great with aesthetics, who were great artists, who were great designers within the campus, people who I could learn from. So that's where I can say that in college is when the real designer in me started getting nurtured. Even though design was always with me, I always thought that I would just keep tinkering around with Photoshop and Illustrator whenever I feel like, but I would stick to engineering or some other job. I never felt that design could be a job, neither in terms of impact, respect in the society, or even money. Even for engineering, although I was studying and doing fairly well in electrical engineering, I liked it, but I didn't really love it. So I could never imagine me doing the work of an electrical engineer all my life. I knew that I had to do something else, and I was fairly confident that, I am that manager, leader sort of material who would probably do an MBA and then keep climbing the corporate ladder one after another. The typical scene, So I started planning a bit during my college days itself. I even sat for some of the companies which came during the placements, the non-core companies. Non-core as in a company which is not directly aligned with your field of study, which was electrical engineering in my case. A lot of people used to opt for these non-core companies which were into general management, finance, or anything else because first of all, these companies would be open to hiring people like me, and secondly, they also paid more than the core companies. So those companies were always a hit amongst all the students, at least in the IITs. So I gave it a shot, I got a couple of shortlists, and I finally made it to an American multinational company out here in Bangalore. I joined them as a project manager. So I took the job up and I did that for a year. I learned quite a lot of things. What a corporate culture is, how does it mean working with different people who are way younger or way older than you. But in my case, since I was right off college, most of the people were way older than me. I also learned a great deal of things around project management, around agile methodologies, and tons of other stuff. But then one fine day, I started thinking, what would happen if I were to disappear? What would happen if I were not there in this company? I gave it some thought and I realized that nothing much would happen. The teams would continue functioning, maybe someone else will come on my place, and even if I'm not present, the team would function all by themselves in a fairly decent way. So that led me into thinking, am I at the right place? Am I doing the right thing? Am I building the right impact? That was a moment when I realized that I need to start thinking more about my career. Until then, I wasn't sure about design as a career, by the way, right? I always thought that I would probably write the CAT examination and get into one of the IIMs and do an MBA out there, like many of my friends from IIT were already doing. But then out of the blue, one fine day, a senior from my college, who was also a design lover and enthusiast just like me, called me up on my phone and he asked me if I would want to work for housing.com. He had recently joined Housing and they had some more openings, so he had reached out to me. To let you know, this was the year 2015 and housing.com was all over the place and people were talking about everything. They had full-page newspaper articles, they had huge hoardings around the city. Everyone was talking about them. People were even comparing them with some top-notch startups from the Silicon Valley. Kids from college who have just graduated out of IIT Bombay and they have built a company that has raised hundreds of millions of dollars. So when my senior actually approached me, I was like, are you sure? Am I even good enough to be a part of that company that everyone is talking about? I had the doubt inside me. He reassured me that I could do it because he had seen my work back in college, and with the analytical skills that I have, it was a good marriage between the graphic design and stuff which I used to do in college and the product design which I will be expected to do if I got through in housing.com. So I thought, let's give it a try. I needed a portfolio to apply to. I didn't have one. So I thought, let's make a mock project out of it. So I had worked on a mock app called Split App. Now, what that Split App was, I'm not going to discuss out here because I have made a dedicated video on my first case study. I will leave it linked in the description. That's very interesting as well. So I highly recommend you go check that out after you see this. Well, that case study actually got me a couple of interviews, and they had also offered me a hands-on exercise, a take-home exercise, which was nothing but designing largely the UI of a weather app, which I believe I did fairly well. I'd made a detailed presentation. And one thing led to another, and I had an offer in hand. And I was the happiest because I got a chance to work as a designer in one of the hottest startups of the country. And just like that, I got my first design job. Now, housing.com was a completely different world from the company that I was already working on. It was a young company, it was a vibrant company. It felt more like a college than the real corporate company where I had worked for the past 1 year, right? I was enjoying it, and at the same time, I also had this inferiority complex inside me because I knew that everyone else was really, really good, way better than me, and I was just a kid out of college. Yes, that's a feeling that I got. And then came my first project at Housing. It was to redesign the contact model. Contact model is nothing but, housing is about real estate. So when you see some property and the user wants to contact the owner or the agent, they would click on a button, and when they click, an overlay, a modal would open up, which would have a few more details as to how I would want to contact, who would I want to contact, and so on, right? That was the contact model. I had to redesign that. There were some newer challenges, new functionality that I had to bring into that. That was also the first time when I heard of and also started using the tool called Sketch. Back then Figma wasn't there. Sketch, I think some of you know what it is. It's very similar to Figma, just that it's not online. It's an offline application, but very similar to Figma in every other aspect. It's a good tool. It still exists. So Sketch was the tool which I learned after I got my first project. And the tool was really easy. So I could just start working on it altogether. So I started working on this contact model, and I realized that, now that I look back and reflect, I feel that I wasn't really focusing on the problem. I just looked at it at a very surface level, and I knew that, okay, this is how it is. I need to bring this element out there. I was thinking element first rather than a problem first. I thought that, okay, I need to bring the details of the agents out here. Should I do it as a drop down or should I do it something else? But I wasn't seeing it from the user first view, as in someone who has come here, someone who has clicked on that button, what would they want to see? What would they want to do? What would confuse them? What would make them happy? I didn't think about any of these things. Essentially, I was not a user-first designer. I was more of a layout-first designer or an element-first designer. And that's where I made the mistake. Although I was trying my best, but I couldn't land at the right designs because I wasn't focusing on the right thing. And I did a terrible job at the final output. So bad that after a couple of weeks, I was actually called into the office of one of the AVPs of design back then. He told me in a very nice way that we liked your work in your interviews and all, but what has happened? Your output is no way a reflection of the person we had met during your interviews. What has gone wrong? They seemed concerned, but at the same time, they had a business to run, so they also needed the right kind of output from me. And after that meeting, I was also sent a very well-worded email, nicely framed sentences and all, which essentially the summary meant that, hey, if you do not improve your work, we'll kick you out. Of course, it was said in a very nice worded way, as I have said. I was on the brink, just one misstep away from falling into the gutter. At the time, one of my flatmates was working in a different startup, and that startup was barely a few months old back in 2015, and he told me that they had some openings for designers. Since I knew that I was at the verge of probably losing my job, I thought, okay, let's give it a shot. If they have openings, I thought I would just speak to them and try to understand. So he got a referral for me, and that company, someone reached out, the HR, I guess, and they'd given me a case study to work on, a take-home case study. In my opinion, at least back then, I felt I did a good job. I made a nice presentation once again, similar to the one that I had made for housing.com, and I sent it over to them, and I never heard back from them. I never heard back from them. Today, when I look back and ponder upon that case study which I had sent to this new startup, I know why they didn't get back to me, because I was again bad. So of course, even that chapter was closed. So the only option that I was left with was to prove myself at Housing, to make sure that I lived up to the expectations of my leaders and my managers who were there. I had one great advantage though. At housing.com, my colleagues, my friends, They were outstanding. They were some of the best in the country, and since I had access to them, I knew that I could learn a lot from them. I just needed the right mindset and the right attitude to learn. So here's what I did. Every day after work, when almost everyone was winding down, I would start my second day. And I would go through the files of the designers that I looked up to, and I would observe each and everything. I didn't just skim through their work. I observed, analyzed, and even took notes. I remember I used to dissect each and everything, right from why did they decide to take this approach and not something else? Even though I was seeing one approach on their sketch file, I would think of 3 other approaches that could be possible and why they might have discarded the other 2 and went ahead with that. I would do all those thinking in my head, imagine by just looking at somebody else's file, which probably doesn't even have explanation as to why they went ahead with this approach and not that. And of course, this was all about decision making. I would also get into the details of the UI. Why did they use this much of spacing? Why is this space slightly less than that? Why is the icon of this size? Why is the opacity this and not that? I would question each and everything. And that exercise taught me a lot about UI design, which no course, no video could ever do. Of course, I've never taken a course, but it was so beneficial. By just observing someone else's file, I could learn a lot. I think that part was mind-blowing. This eventually became a habit, and this routine was so incredible, and I've learned some of the great deal of things during those midnight sessions, which would often go till 2 or 3 in the morning. And this habit stayed with me, not only during my stint at housing, but also beyond that. In fact, it stayed with me for years. And even today, at times, when I'm done with my work, I would just sit with my laptop and just experiment with something new that I have seen somewhere, or maybe learn something new, and so on. I believe that's the best way to upskill when you actually do your hands-on work. I still remember one particular night, of course in 2015, I thought I should learn prototyping. And back then we didn't have tools like Protopie and Principle and all. All that we had was a tool called Pixate. It was a company which was later acquired by Google, and although you could get high fidelity prototypes, but it wasn't all that easy to use. It was just one single screen and things could get really complicated. But if you learned it right, you could actually make some really good things. I remember the first night when I had learned Pixate, I spent the entire night and built a prototype for Tinder, where you could just swipe the card and the next card would come. Yeah, I spent the entire night learn to prototype that. And another time I remember I had redesigned the boarding pass of Indigo Airlines. Just like that. I felt that, this wasn't well designed. The information that the traveler needs to see, they don't really get to see them because there are lots of other things out there. So I redesigned the boarding pass and made my version of it, where I've highlighted the right contents at the right places. Then around that time, there were rumors around the company that there would be a massive company-wide layoff. And there were also news that we were a 40-member team back then, and it would get slashed to 1/4 of what it was. And I was almost certain that I would go. Someone who has received such bad feedback would definitely go. So I thought, okay, let's see what happens. And this was a couple of months after I had received the feedback. And by then, when I was doing this exercise, the routine that I was talking about, I would have gotten better, but I never really heard back from my leaders saying that, hey, you're doing fine now, right? So they told me about the bad feedback and then let me immerse into it and do whatever I could. But they never told me that, okay, you're doing fine now. So that's why I thought that maybe I would go. But then the layoffs actually happened. Out of the 40 members, only 9 were retained, and I was one of the 9 who were retained. This event was a significant turning point in my career and a confidence booster. Although I knew that I was retained not only because I was the top 9 designers or something, it was probably because I was junior and I was probably not drawing a lot of salary. That could also be the reason, because one of the reasons why you lay off people is to save money. In spite of that, it still gave me a lot of confidence that the company believed that one of the 9 people who could drive the vision of housing.com ahead in terms of design could be me, and that was the confidence booster for me. I remember I have worked on numerous experiences on the mobile experience, the web experience, and also the agents app of housing.com. During this time, I also picked up a lot of new skills. In addition to the prototyping that I have mentioned before, I also got into visual design. Yes, I wasn't a visual designer before. I was hired as a pure UX designer who would just make some wireframes and pass it on to a visual designer. And I felt that if others are able to do, why could I not? So I started learning that. In the same way, I also picked up motion design, which turned out to be one of my strong points in my career and something that I do even today as a part of my work. So right around 2016, many people who I used to look up to were voluntarily moving out of the company and going to other companies. And one of the companies where a lot of these people went to was the company called Zeta. which was based out of Bangalore. And one of the designers who I used to look up to one day had again approached me and said if I would want to work for Zeta. And that was a great moment for me, not because I've heard a lot about the company Zeta. I hadn't. It was barely a few months old back then, but I really looked up to the people who were a part of that organization. So I had a few rounds of interviews and I got into Zeta. My 2-year stint at Zeta was all about applying all the things that I had learned at housing. So even though I was learning motion design, learning illustration, learning visual design, I wouldn't really apply them. Most of the things wouldn't really go live on the app because I was still a novice. I was still a kid. Someone else would do further polishing on my work before something would go live. But Zeta was the first stint where all the things that I had learned would directly go live because maybe I had evolved as a person. During this time, I also did a few other things beyond my work. I co-organized the first ever edition of Bangalore Dribble Meetup in 2016, and I also delivered my first design talk at Meta Refresh 2016. Along with that, I also facilitated in my first workshop on motion design. So you see, after learning, now I was at a stage where I was actually teaching. I also got promoted to senior interaction designer at Zeta, and I was mentoring people. I was a part of the interview panel where I was interviewing other people to grow the team. It finally felt like, I am a designer too, and that too a senior one. And with every year, we kept co-organizing the Bangalore Dribble Meetup every year after that. And I also wrote my first design case study on Medium. Well, it wasn't really a case study, it was just an article or a story of how I learned to do isometric illustrations on Illustrator. Some of those articles went viral, by the way, back then. I also started regularly posting on Dribbble. Dribbble is a platform where designers can go post their work, animations, visuals, or whatever, and share it with the community, and people could just like, comment, or give feedback and all. And back then, Dribbble was the place. We would look up to designers out there at Dribbble, and then we would follow designers, we would look into the trends and stuff. It was the thing. So as I started posting regularly, I also gathered a good amount of following out there, and people started knowing me as that guy who works at Zeta and who makes some really cool animations. And then it was 2018, and I felt that maybe I was hitting some kind of saturation at Zeta, and maybe it was time to move on. And along the time, I also got approached by Swiggy, and I decided to speak to them. I got interviewed, and I finally made it into Swiggy. I joined as a lead product designer at Swiggy in 2018, and that was a very different game. It was a very different company, working culture, and people at Swiggy than what I had seen at Zeta or Housing. And after that, I got promoted to design manager when I officially started managing people, then senior manager, and finally director of design, which is the role that I'm holding even today. Now, you remember during my housing days, the other new startup where I had applied to, I've done the case study but never heard back from them. So which company was that? Well, the company was none other than Swiggy, the same company where I have been working for the past couple of years now. It's funny how things come to a full circle, isn't it? Looking back, I think Swiggy's rejection was one of those sliding door moments for me, which led to so many different things. When I didn't hear back from Swiggy, I knew that I had to survive in this company, and for that I had to learn so many different things, burning the midnight oil, looking into the files of the designers and so on, which eventually made me a better designer, a better person, which got me into the company like Zeta, and which eventually got me into the same company where I was initially rejected for, but this time with full glory and with a lot of respect because I did qualify all the interviews. It's that rejection that set me on the path that led to today, where I'm sharing my design and career journey. I hope you found this video useful, and during this video I had also spoken about that case study which got me my first design job. I had made a dedicated video on the same. I will leave it linked in the description. I highly recommend you go check that out. So that was all from my side. If you like this video, please like and share this video in your network, and please hit that subscribe button. It motivates me to create more content for you. This is Sapta signing off.